Alright, so this time around I'm going to look at something more gameplay centric and because it is more quantifiable and familiar both as players and as industry, this will feel a lot more comfortable. Um, so the forest, once again, we look at our steps. First, we're going to establish our intention, what do we want? We're going to review our sources to figure out why we want those. We're going to execute just in broad strokes, and we're going to look at some upside and some iteration. So first off, we have intention. In the light forest, we want the focus to be all on gameplay and learning that. So there's really not much of a narrative focus. Specifically, the pacing we've theoreticized would be effective to have the cave be very narrative intense, albeit without context, and that the forest will be back to happy land, so to speak. To that end, the light forest is idyllic. It's still really nice, very fantastic, and non-threatening, of course. And here's where we're going to focus on just basic platforming elements. So next we look at the context. We're coming out of the cave once again. The light forest is just her imagination, Oscar's imagination rather, and our one other important consideration is that the next section is probably going to have repeated elements from the light forest, and it being the dark forest. We need to keep that in mind, that whatever we make in a light forest segment might need to be featured later with some sort of appropriate twist or alteration. Next up we have execute. So I'm going to take a look at what I actually did for the light forest. So first off, we have what do we have here? Not really a concern for narrative. Actually, before jumping in there, I'm going to take a look at just what I whiteboarded here. So we have Oscar coming out of the cave. I think just to demonstrate, at least, sorry, to back up for a second, my assumption was that whatever we build in the light forest, the easiest thing to contrast that in the dark forest, especially since narratively they're tied together, was to actually lay them out very similarly and see if we're able to distinguish each, both in terms of player expectation, what we teach in the light forest happens differently in the dark forest, but also art can compare and contrast very directly. So my first thought was, let's have a section where art can put some sort of set piece that they can contrast later in the dark forest, but then it's on to just platforming. So here we learn about gliding. We force the player to figure out that they can jump and travel a further distance by holding down jump. So there we have jumping over a static object. Then we have jumping over a moving object. So here we have a deer. We have jumping on platforms, where below there's a jumping deer. We have some birds flying around up here. And lastly, we have a bear who's too tall to jump over. Something to keep in mind is 3 is a very good number. Why? It's almost more of a math thing. 2 is a bit too symmetrical. 3 gives you enough variety without things getting too complicated. Something that occurred to me immediately was, we're talking about basic platforming. There's nothing unique to Oscar, nothing that challenging. If we do want to make consequences, which I assume are bumping into enemies, non-threatening, it's important that we actually make those situations happen. So something to consider for later, but any sort of decent player probably won't make any mistakes up until this point where they might miss the entire idea that it's okay to bump into enemies, which is exactly what we're going to not be doing in the dark forest. So as to the specific consequences, I think I had, the deer is just going to bump you over. It's a medium-sized animal, so if he just kind of pushes you back and you fall down and it takes you a second to get up, that makes sense. Birds, I think, are even less consequential. If I run into them and their flight path takes them into collision with me, they fly away. I have right of way here. With the bear, I think it's still a larger, more intimidating animal, so it's going to kind of grumble, make some sort of noise, but then, walk away. Maybe it scares the player a little bit, but we still don't want much consequence at this point. So yeah, these are the things we've learned: how to jump over something moving, how to jump with some consequences that are just falling. Other than how we're going to fit with the Dark Forest, we're pretty much finished here. So the questions would be, especially thinking about how I was when I first started designing, I worry a lot more about the details and how this is going to stand out, but really we're just trying to get an early cross-section of how all the elements are going to fit together. So rather than populate a slightly more complex puzzle or figure out exact behaviors, it's really important that we get some sound and some art in here to figure out where is the player's headspace at and what's going to feel appropriate. Because the first thing we need to do in taking broad strokes and not going into details is to be humble and assume that we don't know how all these pieces are yet going to interact, and that something out of all these interactions, because there are a lot of different moving pieces, might and likely will provide some constraint and some direction as to what this design should look like. I realized that, well, especially having gone through it, and it took me quite a while to learn this process, it is somewhat of a jump to go from working at a low level and feeling comfortable in tangible details as to how this is going to play. But once you go through this process a few times, you realize that determining things at a high level and in terms of broad strokes will save us a lot of time later and provide better results. So heading into the Dark Forest section, I'll just cover that briefly here. Here we have whatever was in the Light Forest, but it's changed. So I don't know if this is the tire swing and the tire's fallen off on this tree, whichever. Here, where we had a very, what will be very boring section to go over again to learn how to jump, we have the deer, an aggressive deer here, who upon spotting you will charge at you, and that's where we try to give a player a bit of a heads up. Maybe the deer does a bit of a wind up, maybe there's a sound indication, but that's where we start to learn, oh, this is going to be a bit more difficult. I wonder what's changed. And to that degree, that's a really good example. Like, how much is a player going to be wondering what's changed if the mood is altered significantly? If the forest is dark and my feet step on crackly leaves instead of lush grass, and the lighting's gone down. I think it's feasible to hypothesize a player might expect changes in behavior. So we start off really simple. We jump up here. There we have deer jumping, several deer jumping up and down. They're kind of moved up from this section where we got to see the arc and the behavior of the deer. And now those same deer are jumping up here in groups, which is a very classic platforming timing puzzle where I need to go underneath the deer at the right times or over top. Where we do make a change and suddenly bumping into these deer will mean death, and you'll spawn back at the checkpoint. So we head down here, and here these red branches that I'm going to jump on are actually going to break, where maybe they have a little shake animation, but if I fall, then I'm blocked by a bear. And this time the bear is going to be aggressive. If I go towards him, he's going to charge at me, and I need to jump up here and get past the bear that way. Or maybe I've played this game before and I know what's going to happen, or I'm very skilled, and I make these jumps, and once again we have some birds up here who, instead of you knocking them back, will knock you back into the hole where you need to solve this problem with the bear. And that's where we start to teach players something and then show them that in context, maybe things aren't always going to go as expected. Then we have a last scene where in the Dark Forest we spot this woman that we're looking for, and she jumps off into the swamp. Yeah, so to take more of a practical look, what I'm going to do as a designer, first thing I did was it makes a lot of sense to separate each section. So here we have just establishing the mood of the forest in that first jump. Here we have jumping on the branches. Then we have what I decided to do with the bear, which where is he going to walk off to? He actually walks off into this little cave. The transition is actually pretty important in terms of narrative, so I left a section for that. Then the opening to the Dark Forest, I assume we'll want some space to kind of let the player acclimate. Here I figured out that maybe it'd be better to show the player the falling branches here, so when you walk by they'll fall down, you need to dodge them, and later on when you see them over here, some breaking branches, you'll know what to expect. Next up we have where the deer is charging you over here. Then we have this kind of cross-hopping where a bunch of deers are going to be jumping around. Next we have branches that are going to break and some bears. I forgot to add some birds up here. The reason I added a second bear here was, I realized, well, if we're going to come up to a scene where Oscar is going to make a very important phone call, this is a very central moment of the game, maybe we need some anticipation. And to that end, other than this last section here where we do spot, a woman in red jumping down and you're chasing after her, that each section here is specifically divided to note because we might actually want to lengthen these or remove these or add several sections, and it needs to be very flexible in terms of time. If I need to switch this section, I don't want to have to compensate by redoing all the nodes everywhere over here. I want to just be able to move around this section to the right and insert something new. Anyways, realizing that this is broad strokes, we also want to assume that if the complexity and detail and amount of content here isn't enough, that we can simply extend this and say, oh, here's a second jumping puzzle, etc. But without putting all these pieces together first and getting to a point where we're comfortable with how things feel, how the story is telling, there's really not a lot of point to populating those details. Once again, if you think of something really cool, you want to document it, keep it in mind, share it with a couple people, see what kind of upside it can generate. But the amount of time you would spend creating those details just isn't worth it. Likely we're going to see some developments based on base population of all the different disciplines that's going to change what's ideal for this scenario. I think that's where I'm going to leave off the Dark Forest for today. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our common designer pitfalls and why changing paradigms from player perspective to designer perspective and into this idea of intention is difficult, and maybe some steps you could take to better understand what took me the better part of a year to adjust from.